Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Sessions with Paola. This is part 2 of an amazing conversation with Figs. She is a licensed mental health counselor, a sex therapist, and I'm so excited to have her here with me. In part 1, we talked a little bit about childhood sexual abuse and men. We're dedicating these episodes to men. That is what we're focusing on today. And today we're going to talk about vulnerability. And why do we think that men have a hard time being vulnerable? So where I want to start is, how do you define vulnerability?
So vulnerability is kind of like opening yourself up to hurt, to pain. And that's really hard. But what we don't, and we talk about vulnerability, is also opening ourselves up to connection. Opening ourselves up to love, opening ourselves up to intimacy. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. It's just like, it's showing yourself, showing your authentic self and connecting that with others. And unfortunately, when we talk about men and when we talk about masculinity, we talk about how it's hard for them to kind of like allow that, because we have such a high expectation on men to guard themselves. But guarding themselves also means isolating themselves. So I want to kind of like start the conversation there.
I love what you said, opening up myself to pain, but opening up myself to connection, because I am a big believer that someone cannot give you what they can give themselves. So when we ask, I want you to be more emotional, I want you to be more connected, but you're guarding that pain, you're like, nope, nobody, and those protective defenses are up so high that nobody can get through them. It is going to be really hard to feel connected to anyone. Brene Brown is the queen of vulnerability. So I'm going to use her definition because it's one of my favorite ones. Is the willingness to tell the truth and be yourself at the face of uncertainty. And I want to take that word for a minute, Figs, because when people have gone through trauma, uncertainty is terrifying. It is having the courage to show up and be seen when you have no control over the outcome. Right? And I think that that's when you're talking a little bit about opening yourself up. Terry Real, guys, one of my favorite books from him is How Can I Get Through to You? And he talks about closing the intimate gap between men and women. And I want to read to you this passage, and I wonder what you think about this one. But he says, while it is true that girls and women struggle predominantly with shame, boys are subject to a two-step process. First, feeling the shame, and then fleeing from it into grandiosity. Repudiating their inner vulnerability that is made of equal parts humanity and trauma. Boys learn to punish in others what they don't dare risk showing themselves. So good, right?
I love that. Yes. That was really good.
Terry Real, I gotta give it to him. He's amazing, because I think when we think a little bit about that guarding that you're talking about, I think underneath there's so much shame.
Yeah, and pain. And I want to like understand that pain, as much as we kind of numb ourselves and guard ourselves, or what we think we're guarding ourselves from pain, it's not going anywhere. And that's when I see oftentimes before getting to sex therapy is numbing. And I see numbing through substance use. I see numbing through sexual behaviors. I see numbing into how we manage other forms of unhealthy coping skills. And in that numbing, we are just creating more and more disconnecting from our bodies, and more disconnecting from those who want to reach us and connect with us. I love that explanation of grandiosity. You know, with grandiosity, we're also telling people to get back. I got this.
Yeah.
And when we absolutely don't have this.
Yes. And because when we attach judgment, this idea of I got this, when we attach judgment to getting help, knowingly or unknowingly, we're also attaching judgment to giving help. I got this, right? One of the main words that people use, especially men, to define vulnerability is weakness. And I wonder, Fix, what do you think are the barriers that continue to show up that don't allow men to be vulnerable? You've already mentioned a couple of them, but we want to think even about the machista culture.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about machismo, we'll talk about toxic masculinity, but anything else that you see that really keeps men from being vulnerable, for tapping into the pain so that they can tap into that connection?
Yeah. So one of the things I actually want to talk about is what we call hegemonic masculinity.
Okay.
And when we talk about that, it's kind of like groupthink. It's just that there is such an idea of like, we're kind of keeping it into like an ideal form of masculinity, and anything else is kind of like othered. It's completely aberrant. It's so different. So as soon as our idea of like, wow, we have to be powerful, we have to be independent, we have to be dependable, like all that is just broken a little bit, where we're like, I want to connect. The reality is that it is discouraged, is even punished. And we see that in male groups, we see that in male friendships, we look at that in society. As soon as one wants to like, talk about their feelings, now it's feminine, now it's also gay. And it's just like, no, it's just, now I want to feel intimacy. Now I want to integrate and invite people into my inner experience. So I think that's what we see a lot. It's just like, we see discouragement. We see othering, and we see punishment.
Yes, I'm fixing you talked about, because when we think about machismo, right, like there's something when you say punishment of anything that's feminine, right? And in toxic masculinity, we see this too, the peer pressure. Ay, se volvió mujercita o qué? Right? Like, did you become a woman now or what? Right? So anytime people show emotion, it is like, no, that's not welcome here. And how does peer pressure and, this group of men that really don't support each other, but actually make each other go, kind of build those walls that we're talking about. When we think about machismo, right? Because machismo is really interesting for me. You're a Colombian as well.
Yes.
You're also Cuban. And I grew up with, I think machismo is different from being sexist, because I think machismo is almost like the dominance of men. Being sexist is the inferiority of women. Yeah. Because in machismo, there's still a certain loyalty.
Yes.
Right? Like the machismo, the wife is up here. Nobody messes with her, but they're kind of having sex with her from the neighborhood. But que nadie la toque, right? Yeah. Porque esa es mi esposa, right? Like nobody come closer because that's my wife, right? And they always give this person very gentleman. They pay for everything. Those gender roles are very straightforward and very clear. But how would you define machismo?
So it's funny you bring that up. So I kind of want to look at it like in a double-sided, is that when we describe non-Latino men as macho, so when we describe white men as macho, we see them as in this leadership role. And they see them as powerful. It's like, you see what I'm saying? It's just like, why is it that when we look at Latino men and Hispanic men, machismo is kind of like this hatred towards women? But really what machismo is thing of competition. It's about leadership. It's about ambition. And unfortunately, machismo can come off as, well, to achieve that is putting others down. It's seeing others because I need to attain this. And when also, like, I want to bring up is like, it's not all bad. There's also something called caballerismo, como un caballero, which is coming from a Latin word that means kind of like a knight. And the whole aspect of caballerismo is, I want to protect. I want to be part and having an obligation to my family. And that brings in so much, because it also brings in vulnerability and allows men to be emotional in the Latin community. You see what I'm saying?
Interesting, yeah.
So I will say that, like, yeah, machismo is, this kind of like over aggressive presentation of what we consider masculine, but there's more underneath the surface. And as you understand Latin culture and where it comes from, this collectivist identity that I am part of something bigger, it has its role. And when we talk about therapy, it's just like, now, how can I use this role, or how can we accept this role in a way that's also beneficial, not just to you, but the community?
Yes, and talking a little bit about the way that you're describing machismo and breaking it down into a very complex idea, I also think, or I've run into, or I know of machista women.
Yeah.
Right? That if the man exposes themselves emotionally, no, eso me toca a mí. Yo soy la mujer, tú eres el hombre. Right? So I'm the woman in this relationship. You're the male. You're not supposed to show that part of yourself. But I think it's really interesting how you talk about it. And I think for me, it is so important to understand what's beneath, because I'm sure you've dealt with this too, but I deal with machismo in my practice. What is it like to work with a woman? Right? How does this dynamic work? What are the assumptions that you're making? And is there a power dynamic between you and I? And how can we bring that into the room? So important. So this is why I think for men, is going to someone that is trained and it can do the work and understand this in many different perspectives, because we are growing up in a society where there's so much labels. We have a label for everything and everybody. And labels to me are dead ends, because they explain, yes, there's the benefit, but the cost is that we label somebody and that's it. And I don't get to understand how you work, who you are. How do you come to be this way, right? Because if you were someone that grew up, we're going to name this person Jorge or George, and this is a story, guys, of many collective stories that I've heard, and you grew up in the Bronx, where you could either be a lamb or a wolf. And anytime you got home, dad was a full-blown alcoholic, domestic violence in the home. At the time, women were being institutionalized. So mom was either not there, but when she was there, he was heavily medicated. What type of love is this little boy getting? And when he walked out on the streets, he couldn't show up any type of vulnerability or weakness, because that would mean getting beat up, being bullied, and having trauma, nowhere safe, nowhere to turn. Now this person grows up, wants to be in a connected relationship. At the face of disappointment, at the face of lack of love, they are going to put those walls up and nothing is going to get through. So I love what you're saying, Fix, because it is so important to understand what's beneath. Without that, we're not really moving anywhere. What do you think are some of the consequences of men suppressing emotions? What do you think? How do you think that plays out into their other areas of their lives?
Yeah. So, there's no such thing as complete suppression. That's like the first thing I tell my clients. What there is an expression of that suppression. And oftentimes what is acceptable for men to express is anger. And when I work a lot and do a lot of dialectical behavioral therapy, that's actually one of my main ways as a licensed mental health counselor, is just like what my expression of emotion tells others. And anger is the feeling of I feel unsafe, but also is the feeling and expression of back up, back away. And so that's funny that that's the emotion that's acceptable. It's the emotion of keeping others away. So now I'm left to deal with all of this by myself. And anytime I feel something and express it in anger, I'm not allowing them. So what do I do with these emotions? And that's when we then express anger, and oftentimes in aggression, violence, or maybe the opposite. We're kind of like putting it towards ourselves. And that's when we have high rates of suicide ideation, suicidal behavior in men. And tends to be also the most aggressive forms of suicide also. Don't forget
Men
that.
are more likely to act.
Yeah.
Right? So that impulsivity, absolutely.
And also like numbing. We numb through substance use. We also see numbing in terms of self-harm. Like when we think about self-harm, we think mainly as women as cutters, but men self-harm as well. I think what I see most in my office, men will punch walls.
Yep.
Yeah. go to any frat party house, there's just a bunch of holes in the wall. I'm like, where did that come from?
Yes.
That's the suppression. That was emotions. What I was seeing is not anger. I was seeing hurt. And you have nowhere to put that. So who is the victim? Well, probably the landlord.
Exactly.
So I see that a lot in terms of what is suppression, what is vulnerability in men. And it's just an interesting place of being that person and be like, okay, so let's try something else. Like, have you ever tried crying? What would happen? And, you know, my therapy sessions, men will be like, no, oh my God, just expecting me to fully reject them or expecting me to be uncomfortable. And it's like, no, like, what if my reaction is wanting to bring closeness, wanting to understand and empathy? And that is something that is otherworldly. You know, it's kind of like inviting that hurt child that learned that was not okay into the room.
Yeah. Oh, inviting that hurt child who heard that wasn't okay into the room, because a lot of these messages start from childhood.
Yeah.
One of the questions that I often ask people, how old is that feeling? Meaning, when did you start to experience this feeling? And they go back and say, as long as I can remember. And to continue on this topic, Fix, because you're already kind of mentioning something that I wanted to talk about. What do women need to better understand about men's lack of vulnerability? And the way that I often describe anger is like an iceberg. What we see on top is anger, but what we know, guys, iceberg have this like this huge part of them. There's hurt, there's pain, there's helplessness, there's confusion, there's trauma. So I love this idea that when I see that punch wall, I don't see anger, I see hurt. For the women out there that are having a really tough time to see what's behind the anger, behind that unresolved pain, what do women need to better understand about, you know, the lack of vulnerability, men's difficulty with vulnerability?
I think like what we need to learn mostly is how to listen. You know, we kind of like jump into this role of let me fix it. And it goes back to like women were expecting to be nurturers and protectors, and we're like supposed to solve it. And this is also vice versa. So what I encourage, and I like when I do couples counseling, is like taking a pause, see what happens if we just sit in silence. See what happens when a man is approached and, you know, encouraged to share, and there is no judgment. There is no punishment. There is no judgment. Like you were saying, it's just like shame comes from judgment. And see what happens and express that like, oh no, I want to know. I want to know your inner experience because I have no idea. And that just transforms the conversation and does invite. It is a slow process. I'm not gonna lie. It's not gonna happen immediately, because I also see that in the session. It's like in a cis, you know, heterosexual relationship. It's just like, why won't you open to me? And it's just like, now we're judging them for these walls. And what we're trying to do is like, no, these walls exist and there's probably a reason why, but it's not helpful here.
Yes, Fix. And listening, guys, I cannot talk about the ability and the beauty of listening, because not only that comes from fear, how can I get you to be who I want you to be? But especially as Latina women, you know, if our partner is like, oh, well, they're not, you know, they're eating really badly. Bueno, Paola, mira a ver cómo come vegetales. See if he can eat vegetables. How could I make somebody do something? So we get this message that it's up to us to keep the relationship together. Listening, and how can you practice patience as a form of action? Because if we go back to that story of Jorge, that being vulnerable meant being unsafe, how can you really slow down? Because you can take the approach of, why wouldn't you open up to me? But what that's going to do is that's going to distance the person further. And at some point in relationships, really what I tell people is like, hey, listen, what are you willing to live with? Because you also have to make that decision for yourself, right? Like, but pushing and needing and getting angry, that is not going to help. And I think for men, where I always encourage them to start, because this can be very big, right? Again, we're asking men to be vulnerable and they're like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Right? Talk from a place of experience. Be able to say, you know, I am feeling nervous, my tummy's feeling, or my stomach is feeling weird, because I don't know if that is the word.
Yeah.
My stomach is feeling weird. My throat is closing up. You're asking me for something and I have no idea what to say. And that can be frustrating for the partner to hear, but you have to see that as they're coming out from their protective defenses. They're taking a big risk. Sometimes I ask men, I'm like, what is a food or a fruit or vegetable that you hate? I like spinach. So then I encourage them to say, I'm having a spinach moment, which means I don't know what the hell to say in this moment. And I'm feeling really activated or triggered. Start by talking from a place of experience. Any other ideas, things that maybe that you bring into the room and you've already talked a little bit about them, to help men just start, just make that little step forward.
So I like that, because in the sense that when I start every session, like I said with my male clients, is like I always start like, how are you feeling today? And the first thing that comes is like, good, bien, todo bien. And I'm like, I don't want to hear no so, no okay, no todo bien. It's just like, let's start with bringing a feeling, something that is complicated. And it just starts with just identifying. Because as soon as we identify the feeling, we know where the conversation is going. We know where the motivation is. And I even tell like my male clients is that, like, let's say if I'm working with disgust, then then the conversation goes like, what is repelling me? If it's anger, what am I trying to push away? And that is the so much important place here. It's just like, let's start with even feeling the feeling I get often is weird. So I'm like, what's in conflict here? Weird. Like, things are weird today. And I'm like, oh, what's conflicting? You know, just starting there, you're inviting someone kind of like to your inner experience. You don't have to have all the words, but just having that feeling or identifying it is the start. And it's great. I think will be the first place. What I also do a lot with my clients is that, like, we're talking about also like aggression and physical aspect. Men are oftentimes externalizing. So often there'll be days where we're actually going on a jog. Of course, like they're consenting. And I'm like, all right, let's go for a jog. And there's like that kind of like distraction where there's this activity that I'm putting my energy in, and it invites conversation. You know what I'm saying? There is some kind of reason why men are like love sports, is because that is oftentimes where I feel safe to express myself.
Interesting. Yeah.
So I do that a lot. I like to mix up my sessions a bit. Like we'll have like stretch sessions where we're just like kind of like moving our bodies. And it's kind of like moving away from stillness, because stillness also means vulnerability.
Yeah.
So it's a good distraction.
Yes. And in stillness is when a lot of things come up.
Yeah.
I want to take a step back about something that you said, because I think it's so important. People get really comfortable with saying, fine, I'm good, todo bien, right? If you weren't fine, what else would you be?
Yeah.
Right. But I think, with couples, sometimes that intervention is great.
Yeah.
Things like go on a walk because you're not looking at each other.
Yeah.
You're actually or go on a drive and talk about something really difficult, because there's something comforting about that. And you said stillness is vulnerability. Oh, so good. And I think that we carry a lot in our body. There is this concept of the body keeps the score. So stretching and moving is another beautiful intervention that we can utilize in order to continue helping all of you men out there that have done so much and continue to do so much. So thank you again, guys, for listening to us. And you know that there's people here that can help. and welcome you into this space. And Fix, if they wanted to work with you, if they wanted to know more about the work that you do, where can people reach you?
So you can find me on social media. Right now I'm on Instagram and TikTok. It's Figs, Figs Therapy. I'm also on Psychology Today, and there you can read more about me. And also I'm reachable by phone and by email. And then I take clients anytime, pretty much up until evening online.
Awesome. Thank you guys for joining us. Muchas gracias por escucharnos. Thank you for listening. And until next time.